They called it a modernization effort. I called it a calculated exit. I had spent 17 years making sure nothing in that factory ever fell apart, until the day they decided I was what needed replacing. My name is Sean Whitaker. I was the senior industrial systems supervisor at a mid-sized manufacturing plant just outside of Cleveland. 17 years, most of them under fluorescent lights, chasing down inconsistencies in line pressure, recalibrating robotic arms, rewriting maintenance routines at 3 in the morning, just so production would not halt when daylight came. No one sees the person behind the blinking green lights when everything runs smoothly. You are just part of the hum. Invisible until someone decides they want newer hums. It started quietly. A few consultants in fitted suits walking the floor with clipboards, nodding at equipment like it was beneath them. At first, I shrugged it off. Corporate brought in outsiders now and then, usually a temporary performance audit or cost control initiative. We would adjust a few things, shave 10 seconds off a cycle time, and they would vanish just as quickly. This time was different. They were not asking how things worked. They were telling us how things should work, without diagrams, without numbers, just vague statements like, Industry 4.0 is about connectivity, and legacy systems limit our scalability. They used words like agility and optimization, but never once did they bend down to listen to the compressor we had nursed through 5 winters. I started getting left-off emails. My weekly reports were not being acknowledged. My requests for parts approval sat in inboxes for days. Then came the meeting. They called me into a small conference room that smelled like dry coffee and fresh toner. The plant manager sat there with 2 of the consultants, one of whom was already eyeing the hallway as if he had somewhere better to be. Sean, we appreciate everything you have done, the plant manager started. But the company is moving toward a leaner, digitally transformed model. Your role, in its current form, does not align with where we are heading. No thank you, no warning. Just a packet, a severance agreement, and a 5-minute explanation dressed in buzzwords. I did not argue. I asked one question. When does this go into effect? End of week, he replied, not meeting my eyes. We have brought in a new operations strategist who will take over systems continuity. Systems continuity. That was their name for what I had done every day for nearly 2 decades. I boxed up my things, handed over the badge, and walked out into a drizzle that had turned to cold mist by the time I reached the parking lot. It was not sadness that hit me, it was clarity. You spend so long being essential that you forget how replaceable they believe you are. For the first few weeks, I stayed quiet. I signed the paperwork. I let the story settle. I knew how this played out. They would plug in someone fresh with a tablet and a fancy workflow app and expect the machines to comply out of a sheer modernity. But these machines were old. They did not respond to QR-coded manuals and Bluetooth diagnostics. They needed hands, ears, they needed intuition, something no spreadsheet or cloud system could replicate. It was a month later that the first product failure showed up on the distributor logs, then another and another. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but the reports kept coming. Product defects, safety margins slipping, rework piles growing, customers asking questions. I started getting texts from the guys still on the floor. Sean, did you ever fix the pressure delay in line 4's 4th valve? Hey, do you remember the override code for the mold press when the hydraulic temp gets too high? Do you still have that spreadsheet you built for the torque recalibration thresholds? I answered the first few. Out of habit, out of loyalty. But I saw what was happening. They had removed the human link from the process and were now watching everything fall out of rhythm. Then I stopped replying. It was not vindictive, it was a line. They had wanted modernization, they got it. Full automation, remote dashboards, minimal staffing. And with it came the blind spots no consultant warned them about. The mold tolerances I used to check by hand, off by just enough to cause a 7% return rate in a critical part. The thermal compensation that was only programmed for winter settings, running full summer cycles, expanding past safety limits, the calibration routine that only worked if run after a certain warm-up, ignored entirely by the new automated scheduler. It all stacked up, quietly, like a slow leak no one notices until the floor is soaked. A few weeks later, I heard they paused production on one of the main product lines. Too many defects, not enough time to resolve them before the next shipment window. That meant penalty clauses. That meant angry distributors. That meant internal meetings with phrases like root cause analysis and temporary remediation. I imagined the boardroom. The same suits who handed me that severance folder now flipping through printouts of failure rates and supplier complaints. I wondered if they remembered me, or if I had already become a line in a transition memo. I did not reach out. I did not need to. They knew. Then came the call, not from the plant, from one of our old component suppliers. A mid-tier vendor that made precision couplings for one of the assemblies we used to produce. Sean, we heard what happened. Look, we have had some issues sourcing reliable testing protocols for some of the newer clients. We were wondering if you might be open to consulting, maybe even temporarily. It was not revenge. It was not triumph. It was just the natural arc of consequence. You remove the people who hold the system together, and the system will remind you why they mattered. I agreed to help. Quietly, remotely. A short-term contract just to stabilize their test protocols and help their QC team set up some new benchmarks. But word spreads. The same week I started consulting for the supplier, I got an email from someone I had not heard from in over a year. He used to be our regional logistics coordinator. He had moved to a competitor last spring. His message was short. Heard what happened. If you are open to talking, we are expanding. We need someone who actually knows how to build systems that do not fall apart. I left the message unanswered. Not because I was uninterested, but because I knew the story was still unfolding. There is something oddly peaceful about being removed from the thing you once gave your entire self to. You start to see it more clearly. You stop defending it. You begin to measure it by what it actually was, not what you hoped it would become. When I looked back at those 17 years, I did not see failure. I saw a system that worked until someone decided the system itself was old news. But machines do not care about trends. They care about function. You can rebrand the workflow. You can repaint the floor. But if you do not understand the rhythm of the place, it will push back. The factory pushed back. And the people who thought I was just a piece of the old model, they are now trying to figure out how to bring that piece back, without admitting they ever needed it. That is where things started to change. They tried to fix the system without fixing the knowledge gap. And that was the first real mistake. The second came when a product batch failed a random compliance inspection. It had nothing to do with sabotage. I want to make that clear. There were no cut wires, no missing components, no intentional missteps. Just a slow, technical degradation. Exactly what happens when a process is handed to someone who understands theory but has never spent a winter in the plant with their hand on the panel, waiting for the compressor to stop humming wrong. I had been gone 4 months. The product in question was part of a small but critical line we used to ship every quarter. It was a sealed housing for a medical-grade actuator, tight tolerances, temperature-sensitive epoxy, and a very specific curing cycle. If the epoxy does not hit exact conditions, the bond fails under pressure. We had seen it once, maybe twice in 17 years, but we had protocols, alarms, manual checks, and when those failed, we caught it on post-assembly stress testing. Apparently, they had removed the final stress test to streamline efficiency. That is how the report phrased it. I read it in the complaint filed by a federal compliance officer to the Office of Product Safety. It was forwarded to me by a former team member I had once trained during his first month on the job. He did not add a message, just the PDF. I read every word. The product had failed in the field, not just in testing, out in the real world, in an actual operating environment. The epoxy bond cracked under pressure, leading to an internal fault cascade. The unit did not explode, but it shut down the device it was attached to, which happened to be part of a larger hospital monitoring system. No one was injured, thankfully. But it triggered a mandatory recall and an immediate halt on that entire product line until an audit could verify root cause. That was the moment they knew. And when you have to admit to regulators that the flaw was not in the material, but in the process, more specifically in the way you change the process, you invite scrutiny far beyond your walls. That same week, I received a phone call from someone in the legal department of a firm I had never heard of. They said they represented an outside audit group tasked with evaluating the recall from a liability standpoint. They wanted to ask a few informal questions about my time at the plant. I declined, not out of fear, just a principle. I had no interest in playing the revenge game, but I did not want my name appearing in some summary that would eventually be pored over by people who had no idea what actually happened between those walls. I had already started taking on more consulting work by then, quiet gigs, quality workflows, system diagnostics, small companies that needed someone to look under the hood and tell them where the engine really was leaking, not where the software thought it was. It felt good to build things again, cleanly, from scratch. No politics, no hollow titles, just the work. But the plant, the one that had let me go, was not staying quiet. Word spread in the industry. The phrase over-modernized started showing up in supply chain meetings. I heard from a former vendor that the term legacy knowledge had become a point of discussion in a competitor's boardroom. Then came the real surprise. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Friday afternoon. The sky was flat gray. Early winter. I had just finished writing up a technical report for a small aerospace parts maker outside Chicago. The phone rang. It was the plant manager, the same one who had read that severance note to me like he was reciting an airport delay. He sounded tired. His voice had that brittle undertone you hear from someone trying to stay in control of a conversation they know they have already lost. "Sean, I hope this is not a bad time." I paused. "It is unexpected." "I know. Look, I will get to the point. We are in a bit of a situation. I was wondering if you would be open to coming in for a conversation." He used the word conversation the way a man treading water uses the word lifeboat. I did not say yes. I did not say no. I told him to send me the terms in writing. Professional. Clear. I had no intention of walking back into that building just to be blamed for a mess I did not create. The email came 3 hours later. A formal request for a temporary re-engagement under a fixed-term consulting agreement. They were not offering a job back, they were offering a patch. I declined. 2 days later, the operations director called. Different tone, more measured. He asked if I would consider leading a review of their existing workflow documentation, not as an employee but as an external specialist. "Help us get the fundamentals back in place," he said, "before we sink further." I agreed, not out of pride, but because somewhere inside me, The systems guy still wanted the machine to work. I returned to the plant a week later, as a contractor. The badge they gave me was blue this time. Temporary, no access to most areas. I smiled when I saw it. I walked to the floor with a clipboard, not because I needed one, but because that is what the new guys always did. I figured it would help them swallow it better. The same lines were there, same machines, same faces mostly, but the energy was different. There was hesitation in the air, like everyone had been taught to wait before doing anything, just in case the algorithm said otherwise. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Not the loud kind, the subtle hums, slight whines from bearings that had not been lubricated on time. A delay in the pneumatic return from one of the molding arms. The kind of delay you can only feel, not hear, unless you have been there long enough. They had installed new dashboards, wireless sensors, real-time process analytics, and all of it looked good on a screen, but nothing matched the physical reality. I asked the maintenance team if they had been logging by hand. No, they said. That was one of the changes. Digital only now. They said logs were inefficient. I walked over to a control panel and asked for the last manual calibration entry for one of the injection units. The operator looked nervous. We have not been doing those manually either. The new system adjusts it automatically based on flow predictions. I nodded. No one had verified the predictions. They had replaced human checklists with predictive automation and assumed it would self-correct. I made a note, then another. By the end of the day, I had 2 full pages of process adjustments, most of them minor, some of them critical. I handed them over to the new operations specialist they had brought in. Young guy, smart, but anxious. He looked at the list like it was written in code. These are just small inefficiencies, he said. Nothing catastrophic. Sure, I replied. That is how failure works, slowly, until it is not. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, then nodded. The company implemented 15 of the changes that week. Product defect rates started dropping within days. Stress test failure numbers fell. The epoxy issue was isolated and resolved, not because of a new resin, but because the curing chamber's thermal sensor had drifted by 2 degrees, and no one had checked the manual override in 3 months. The return rate for the recalled product dropped low enough to remove regulatory heat. The plant manager called me into his office the next week. Same office I had been let go from. He stood behind his desk this time. "Sean, I want to thank you." I said nothing. He looked like he wanted to explain, maybe justify something, maybe himself, but the word stayed caught somewhere in his throat. I stood, nodded, and left. You do not go back to a burning bridge. You walk away from the smoke. That consulting engagement ended quietly 2 months later. They offered to extend it. I declined. I had other offers by then, better ones, from companies that did not treat experience like a disposable part. The truth is, modernization is not a villain. It is necessary. But when you confuse new with better, you stop listening to the people who actually know how things work. I was not against change. I had been improving systems my entire career. But change without understanding is just noise. And noise breaks things. Now I work on my own terms. I consult, I building, I advise, and I watch companies make the same mistake until they realize the value of people who remember where the wires run under the floor. 17 years they had me. 17. And all it took was one flawed theory in a conference room to decide I was obsolete. Now they build off my notes. I left quietly again. Same way I had the first time, except now I had no bitterness in my chest. No confusion, just closure. They had called me back to clean up the failure they refused to acknowledge. And I did. Not for them, but for the people on the floor, for the machines that had been humming too long under poor judgment, for the systems I helped build that deserved better than blind automation. But I didn't stay. You don't rebuild trust in the same room that broke it. By then, I had momentum elsewhere. Word travels fast in industries like ours, not through headlines, but through vendor calls, supplier whispers, audit reports that don't make the press, but shape how capital moves. I had 2 offers in the same week I wrapped up my contract. One was from a lean manufacturer in the Midwest. Medical components, small batch, high precision. They wanted me to lead quality systems, top to bottom, with the freedom to set the rules, not just follow someone else's. The other was more surprising. It came from a competitor of my old plant. Not direct rivals, but close enough. They knew the story. Everyone did by then. Their offer wasn't for consulting, it was for redesign. They wanted me to come in and rebuild their aging production framework. Modernize it, but the right way. Not by stripping it down and feeding it to a software suite. By blending the old with the new. Preserving the logic of systems that had worked for decades, while layering on the kind of automation that actually supports human precision, not replaces it. They didn't say innovation, they said alignment. That was the difference. I met their executive team in person. A small conference room, no buzzwords, just shop talk. They asked me what I'd do first. I said I'd listen. Before changing anything, I'd walk the floor, meet the people, learn the rhythms. The failures aren't in the reports. They're in the way hands hesitate when a machine groans differently. Silence. Then the COO leaned back and said, "We've been waiting for someone to say that." I took the job. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a parade or a title embossed in chrome. But it gave me something I hadn't had in years. A clean slate, backed by people who wanted the truth more than they wanted the illusion of progress. I spent the first 3 weeks just walking, not directing, not changing, listening, logging, watching. I kept a black notebook in my coat, scribbled in it like it was scripture. Not numbers, those were easy to find. I wrote down movements, habits, hesitations. I watched how people reacted when systems slowed. Whether they reached for a tool or looked up at the ceiling. I looked for knowledge, not in memos, but in muscle memory. Then I started drawing. Flow maps, decision trees, error routes, bottleneck traces. And then I called a meeting. Only operators. No management, no IT, no department heads. Just the people who knew how the plant really worked. They were skeptical at first. Used to being told, not asked. But when I laid out the first redesign proposal and said, "Tell me what's wrong with it," the silence cracked, and out came 17 years of buried brilliance. Improvements never heard, fixes never approved. Workarounds that had become the real system behind the dashboard lies. We rebuilt from there. Sensor upgrades, but only where they helped reduce noise, not replace eyes. Predictive systems, but with manual override logs tied to bonuses for catching discrepancies. We created pause points in every workflow, moments where a human, not a computer, made a judgment call. And it worked. Yields improved. Downtime dropped. Scrap rates fell below anything they'd projected in their 5-year modernization plans. 6 months in, they gave me full autonomy to overhaul every plant in their network. It was around that time that I heard from the old plant again. Not directly, but through whispers. They had brought in another consultant to try and reboot the modernization project after my contract ended. Word was, he lasted a month. He didn't understand the process, didn't want to listen to floor staff, and tried to implement a full robotics phase without accounting for ambient temperature variances in one wing of the plant. Machines began failing again. A second audit flagged them for compliance drift. They started losing clients. Quietly, at first, but steadily, some of those clients came to us, not because we were cheaper, but because we could promise stability, because they knew who was building their systems, and because reputation spreads faster than a product recall. It wasn't about revenge. I didn't smile when the calls came in, I didn't gloat, but I didn't stop them either. Because I wasn't the one who burned the bridge. I was the one they pushed off it. They had 17 years of expertise in their hands. They threw it away because it didn't come with a touch screen. And when the lights started flickering, they realized that modernization without memory is just a prettier form of chaos. These days, I lead a small task force across 5 facilities. I still walk the floors. I still carry that same black notebook. Still ask questions no dashboard can answer. And sometimes, late in the afternoon, I think about the old place, about what we could have built if they'd just paused long enough to ask, what do we already know? Instead, they asked, what can we replace? You can modernize a building, but you can't automate instinct. You can't outsource experience. And if you fire the people who remember how the whole thing was built, don't be surprised when it starts falling apart,